You're listening to Coffee and Culture on Talk 1260 and 103.7 KTRC, streaming at santafe.com. My name, as always, is Matthew Chase Daniel, and I'm your host every other week. Today, I'm talking with artist James Gould, and we're sitting in his studio on Industrial Road, which is called the Trapezium because it's sort of a rectangle, but not really. More of a trapezoid sort of thing. No right angles in the corners. And James has been in the studio for a number of years, and it's full of his artwork and tools and clamps and power tools and things he's found that look like art and things he's made that look like things that he found. And anyway, James, I've known for a few years, a little bit, but have gotten to know him more in the last week or so because he's been installing this big, beautiful, a big, small tower kind of structure in the rail yard, a piece of sculpture, a building. It's called SPRICKLE, S-P-R-I-C-K-L-E, which is a word I think he made up. But
True.
It's, yeah,
True that.
Evocative word for the piece. And so we're going to talk about that piece to start with. So welcome, James.
Thank you, Matthew. I appreciate you doing this.
Yeah.
So our listeners might want to have more information about SPRICKLE. You've done a good setup.
Yeah.
Essentially, I took a quantity of salvaged lumber, designed and constructed a sculpture that's in the familiar form of a building that kind of suggests a barn, a shed, a house, maybe a playhouse or a granary for those that might be familiar with those kind of agricultural structures.
Yeah.
And that was intentional. Part of the inspiration was a barn that I saw up near Cuesta. But also, I think there's a value in a familiar form. I kind of think of it as a way into the piece for viewers. That they're confronted with this structure that looks a little bit familiar. There's kind of some handholds to relate to.
Right.
And then they're kind of, so I imagine anyway, left to their own devices to scroll through their memory or associate the structure with a barn or a house or however they might relate
when you
to
first
it.
see it, when I first saw the model pictures of the model of it before you made it, it looked somewhat utilitarian in that way. It looks like a building, but then you look at it and it's like no one built a building this way because there's only half the boards that would sheathe it are there. So the barn you saw in Cuesta had once been a full-on barn,
Yes.
but a bunch of boards had blown off and rotted away.
Right.
And so there's this play of light and shadow that happens. And you took that a step further and made it new, but out of old wood, and sort of intentionally evoking the deterioration. But the whole thing is very solid, and I know because I've been up on the top of it,
Yes.
putting it together.
Yes, all of that is true, and there's a few reasons for all of that. Part of the light and shadow play is a huge important part of the piece. I think that offers a lot of visual interest, and it is purposefully a very open basket-like structure. You can see through it, and for me personally, that perceptual playground, like and it's hard to explain in words without looking at it, but you see a piece of it, and in some instances you're not sure where it's located, if it's behind or in front of another piece, and then the light and shadow collisions for me are a delightful aspect of the piece. Aside from that, the you spoke of the barn that has the missing pieces that was once a different thing and was once a more airtight, waterproof structure no longer, and that's a part of SPRICKLE as well, which is more of a, dare I say it, intellectual construct of this was maybe once a useful thing, but not so much now, and I think that veers off into other associative, arenas like, ghost towns and maybe ghost stories. There's also
we're able to project a whole bunch of our own history and our own knowledge and our own culture onto these things that feel like they have some long and twisted history.
Yeah.
And I think that's great. I mean, I think humor is a great way that in a lot of people's art where there's humor in it, I think it's a doorway in for people.
Yes.
They're drawn in by the humor, and then they're affected by the art in whatever way, whatever the art is saying, aside from the humor. And I think pulling from familiar forms like the granary, barn structure, playhouse structure, it evokes all this stuff. We're all of a sudden engaged with it.
Yeah.
But then we look closer and we get other meanings too.
Yeah.
I think that's great. I love that in art.
Yeah, and with SPRICKLE, I think it also, part of that linkage is with fairy tales. Which and a couple of people have kind of mentioned that to me, that and in thinking about it, although that wasn't an overt intention of mine, I welcome that response because fairy tales have this wonderful kind of spooky sometimes, and also
Gretel's cookies. I saw them when I walked over there. There was a whole line of cookies. You didn't notice that?
I did not. But yeah, I think that's a wonderful place to go with it. And I also had no idea of the Baba Yaga hut from Slavic folklore that another friend, when she saw it, she's like, oh, it's like a Baba Yaga hut without the chicken legs.
Right.
It
is on legs, which is a great unusual thing.
Yeah.
We don't see that, especially around here much. Things up off the ground. Things are adobe buildings on the ground, in the ground, of the ground. And this is perched, and it's bigger on top, wider and longer both on the top than it is on the foot. And so it's got a playful, precarious look to it. It's very solid. No one needs worry. It's not going to fall over or blow over. It's all very well engineered. I can vouch for that. And but it's got a playful aspect in that, in the balance, the delicate balance of that it's standing.
Yeah, and that's really my intuition at work in terms of a design sensibility that, I can't really account for in a real precise, articulated way. It just what I felt it needed,
right?
To carry that, spirit, if you will, that a certain lightness and
there was that I saw a picture of a playhouse you built for your nephews, maybe.
Yes.
Many years ago, that had very similar legs.
Right, and in that setting, that playhouse is kind of in a watershed area near a creek, so that there was a
reason for that,
a particular reason to have it on stilts. But I like that aesthetic, and one of the other architectural influences for SPRICKLE is Japanese architecture, of which some of their older folk houses from a bygone era have that kind of elevated quality, and a lot of the timber framing aspects, which
we
I
see that
incorporated.
In the gable ends and the eaves and stuff with the mortises and the crossing members and. And
that
was in the playhouse too.
Yes, it was.
Yeah.
Yes, it was.
Yeah.
And revisiting that some of those motifs from the playhouse that I built for my nephews, 30 some years ago, there was something just on a personal level that I kind of wanted to revisit that project and kind of dress it up a little bit.
That was beautiful. I saw that. I was like, wow, those are some lucky kids. Have that to play.
Yeah.
Very magical too.
Yeah.
In the way this is. So We're going to have to go to a break in a bit, but it's in the rail yard. If you go Paseo de Peralta, Site Santa Fe, then there's a parking lot behind that, then there's the bathroom in the community buildings, then a green grassy slope that goes down, and then a big long area of crusher fine dirt, and you'll see it as you walk across that towards La Choza and the community garden. Can't miss it, it's right in the middle of that space. It's about 15 feet tall and about
15 feet tall. The footprint is about 4.5 by 7 feet.
Yeah. But it's it's a big great thing. You can also see it driving past like Whole Foods.
Yep.
Down that way. So we'll be right back. You're on Coffee and Culture, or we're on Coffee and Culture, and you're listening. You're back listening to Coffee and Culture. We're on Talk 1260 and 103.7 KTRC, streaming at santafe.com. I'm Matthew Chase Daniel, and I'm talking with James Gould in his studio here in Santa Fe. James has lived in Santa Fe since 1994 or 5, somewhere in there, which is 30 years?
Yep.
So long time. You grew up in upstate New York in Lockport, which is on the Erie Canal.
Correct.
Near Buffalo.
Correct.
And your father was a model maker for...
He was a model maker for a General Motors radiator division.
Right. And part of SPRICKLE... So when you told me the story, when you were a kid, your father had a workshop at home.
Yep.
And in the workshop, he had a stack of boards tucked up high somewhere on the shelf.
Yes.
And he said, James, don't...
Yeah, they were off limits. Yeah.
You're not allowed to use those boards.
Right.
And time goes on, and your father's no longer alive.
Correct.
And you ended up helping to clean out his house.
Right.
And you took at least one of those boards back to Santa Fe.
Yeah, I brought 2 of those boards back, and they're very meaningful for me because they're stamped with Harrison's Radiator Division, Lockport, New York, with some other information. They were crates that the material was delivered to the factory, and so he salvaged those boards and held them for my whole life,
right.
Pretty much, intending to do a project with them, which he never got to.
And you never knew what that project would have been?
Well, he built bird houses and bird feeders and all manner of things. He was a maker and influenced me a lot. And when we were clearing out the house and it was last call, there were the boards, and I thought, okay, I've got to keep a couple of these, and so I was intent on using one of them in SPRICKLE, which I did. It's mounted up in the ceiling.
Yeah.
And that's just a personal note that, and I think my pop would be pleased to see it, and I think he would get a kick out of the piece, and
I imagine so.
Yeah.
It's great to see that little homage to him up there in the rafters.
Yeah.
So you grew up there. You ended up going to college and studying art.
Yep.
Which wasn't something that was sort of part of your family history.
No, not at all. In Lockport, it's a blue collar town. I mean, you dream of getting a job at Harrison's. That's kind of like your ticket. And all through school, I was gravitated toward doing artwork from very early. I was blessed with very good art teachers, one of whom pretty much single-handedly got me into college with a scholarship. My parents pretty much, kind of just left me alone. They were kind of like, okay, well, your grades are good and you've got this scholarship, so okay. I mean, I was really the first, of my family to go to college.
Yeah.
And,
do you have siblings? Or
I have an older brother. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
And so I was looking through some old artwork of yours that you sent me some pictures of.
Yep.
And there's one of the earliest pieces. So you're maybe a little older. You're born in like 1959.
59. Yeah.
Right. the early 60s,
Yes.
1959.
Yeah.
So you did this drawing in 1977 of a eye bolt on a piece of lumber.
Yep.
And the lumber's kind of worn a little or
Right,
cracked or split.
right.
And it's this you're very good at drawing, very good draftsperson. And so you see the wood grain, you see the eye bolt going through, you see the texture of the worn wood. And it could be almost a picture of a detail of SPRICKLE.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting observation. I know the drawing and remember the context. That was done at in a drawing class early in maybe my freshman year, and we went to a college professor's farm, and that bolt was on a clothesline outside in a weathered board, and that's kind of what I did.
You sat there and drew it.
Yeah. In a very highly realistic rendered way. So,
right.
Yeah.
And
but that's interesting.
I loved seeing that. I was like, oh, 77, that was a few years ago, and it looks like right now.
Right.
And you've made art, and you've done paintings and drawings and furniture making and a lot of different things. The stuff of yours that is most compelling to me is the stuff that's meticulous. And whether it's like that drawing or SPRICKLE, which is both very meticulous, pretty planned out. There's a beautiful model of it. It looks very similar to the model, but it's obviously different. But then it's made of weathered boards, splintered boards. It doesn't look meticulous, and so it's this great. And the same with this eye bolt. It's very meticulous, but it's not a drawing of something that was meticulous. It's some old splintery thing. And so, I guess what I'm trying to say is, you've managed to have this blend of control and letting go of control that works really well. And working with you over the past week, it's like you have plans, you have drawings, you have this sort of kit that you've made, because you made this in your studio and outside your studio, and then disassembled it and brought it in pieces over to the Railyard to put it together. And so can you talk a little about that balance between form and freedom?
Well, it's a tricky balance. It's hard for me to continue this conversation without introducing the notion of perfectionism,
right?
Which is a pernicious beast that I've wrestled with, and so part of the meticulous quality is coming from a perfectionist place,
right?
Which I've come to be very suspicious of and kind of loathe that tendency, which I think sometimes results in me wanting to eschew that,
right,
and go the other way,
right,
a much looser context. So it is this dance between those characteristics.
Right, like when you were making furniture, it's much more meticulous and perfectionist, and some of the forms are exquisitely beautiful. Some are more, don't thrill me as much. But no matter that, they're very controlled and planned and meticulous and perfectionist. But then later, like when you moved into this studio and did a show of dozens or hundreds of things, some were drawings, but some were these found things.
Yes.
And more recently, like photograph of a leaf on the ground.
Right.
Where you're more, as much as you are making, you are editing what you see in the world.
Yeah.
And presenting that. And we see that also in Preposterous Abundance, which people may have seen. It's outside the studio on Industrial Road, and it's up off the ground on a little sort of deck thing, and it's against the side of the building. It's a wheelbarrow with a few things piled in it that is preposterous. It's a huge pile that goes, how tall,
That's probably 15, 16 feet tall as well.
Right. Again, like SPRICKLE, only more so, the balance is precarious, and it's beautiful, and it is preposterous, and it is abundant, and it's what are some of the things in there?
Well, so many of us have a tendency to accumulate. I think that if you go out on a hike with a group of people, there are going to be some people that come back with stones and things in their pockets that they've gathered along the way. I think that that's just, a bellwether of some people pick up stones and some don't.
Yeah.
I, of course, come back with stones and things and sweep up things on the street and around or just,
You're looking around.
I'm looking around but I'm also at a point in my life where I ask myself, where are you going with all this stuff? Really? So when I got the workspace here and I had this opportunity of what I think of as a playground outside, I thought, I'm just going to do some public art out there for myself, and I'm going to use everything that I have. I'm just going to use it all.
Yeah.
And so the Preposterous Abundance started from the wheelbarrow and went from there.
Yeah. Well, it's great. People should come by and see it. Industrial Road comes off of Seiler Road. And if you drive down Industrial, it's on your right. Can't miss it. It's been here for a while. It'll probably be here for a while. We got to go to a break. We'll be right back. You're listening to Coffee and Culture with Matthew Chase Daniel, and our guest today is James Gould. You're back listening to Coffee and Culture, a podcast of past shows you can find on your favorite podcast platform. Look up Coffee and Culture with Matthew Chase Daniel, or you can go to my website, which is chasedaniel.com. James Gould is the guest here. Another thing, that older piece of yours that reminded me of SPRICKLE looking through is a drawing of Spiro's Diner in 1988, where it's a view of a person or two in a diner and maybe a window and booths and stuff, but rather than like shading and stuff, you're just doing outlines of everything. Yep. So it's these, what are actually different planes of sight, but creating a rhythm that is in the drawing not dependent on what they are or what plane they're at, and that's the way SPRICKLE. So SPRICKLE, the sculpture in the Railyard, has like two of the walls are doubled walls. There's a plumb wall and a wall that angles out a bit. So when you look at the outside wall, you're also looking through it at the inside wall. You're also looking through that inside wall at the next inside wall and the next. You're looking at four walls, and you're looking at the light coming through the other walls that's putting light and shadow on those walls. And so in a certain way, there's a resemblance to that drawing in that it doesn't matter what plane you're looking at. You're getting these rhythms and geometry.
Yeah. That's very perceptive of you, Matthew, and I appreciate that observation, because those aspects which do have there's a certain formality to that type of planar design, and I do come from this old school, if you will, of modern painting that's all about the flatness of the canvas and that kind of stacked layered quality, and that's part of just how I operate as an artist with that kind of sensibility. So that's certainly a part of SPRICKLE, if you choose to read it that way, or it's not imperative, but it is kind of buried in there with, and part of that is me just doing that and for myself, because that's what I like to look at, and I'm intrigued by those layers and that seeing through it and subtle relationships of the shadow and maybe a line that is cast by a wire that I do approach it as drawing, if you will, with the light and dark and the lines of light and shadow and
right. Yeah, and there's something about building it out of, there's a board and then there's a cap and then there's a board and there's a cap. The boards are like lines. Yeah. And so it is a lot like drawing. Yeah. So after art school, you opened a bookstore in Rochester, New York?
Yes, I did.
And I was reading something you wrote, and you were not a huge book enthusiast.
Not in a way.
That's
yeah.
not what drove you to.
No. I had kind of backed myself into a corner after college. I wasn't keen on going to graduate school to get a degree and get a job teaching, which is kind of, in those days, and maybe still, what an artist does. You get
I followed the same course of not going to graduate school.
For the same reason.
Yeah, I didn't want to teach, and I wanted to make things.
Yeah.
And I thought I should just make things rather than go learn more about the philosophy of making things
Yeah.
But,
so in my case, I was kind of backed into that corner, and on a sort of a lark, I thought, well, I'm going to open this used bookstore, and when it fails, I'll do something else. And but it didn't fail. And so partially it became the thing I was making, and became my project, and for 11 years was really my world. And along the course of that period, I did rent a studio at one point. I was painting and making some sculptures, and in fact, this piece here was done in that era.
Oh, yeah, I saw that. It was a picture of something similar, maybe inside a box.
It wasn't a box, but I took it out of the box recently. For our listeners, this is a bundle of sticks wrapped in wire. And so the art making has always kind of percolated through. And one of the things that when I look back on that period now, from my present, station, if you will, I think that I started a lot of things, a lot of paintings, and I kind of would get to a point, and I would kind of get stalled. And I now realize that I think it was more about me not having the confidence in myself to believe that, you can make good paintings, you can produce art, and so I got in there, I started things, and then I hit a wall, and I think it was self-doubt and fear that kind of held me back
of
from.
Of course, that happens.
So
to a lot of us.
yeah. But then
the bookstore was more of a direct, understandable thing than the art in a way. So maybe there was some comfort, like you get a book, you buy a book, you sell a book.
And I was always kind of tinkering with the shop, and and that's how I earned my living for many years. But I grew weary of it. I was done with it as a
It sounds
as a
like you
project.
were more interested in building the bookstore than in running the bookstore.
Yeah,
in a certain way.
That's a fair statement. Yeah.
And you seem very passionate still as a maker.
Yeah.
You were saying your father was a maker.
Yeah.
And you're a maker.
My mom too, really.
Yeah.
That's definitely my heritage and my purpose in life. Really, is just an artist maker. I have to do it. I mean, it's just.
Right.
I have to. It's just.
Well, so I would say there's 3 pieces of yours that are recent, that are in the same vein, that I really like a lot. One is SPRICKLE, one is Preposterous Abundance, which we were talking about before, and the other, which is maybe called Deliver Us, which is an old laundry cart or mail cart with these wooden surfboard ladder-like things extending and poles.
Wings,
and,
you could say,
sort of this, it looks very well built, very somewhat functional, but for no function that we could decipher.
Right.
And that's another piece that you built here. And it seems like all 3 of these pieces, they're in a way they're different from work you've done before. And they're works that were maybe less, in terms of what we were talking about, control and freedom and letting things evolve. You were saying when you started Preposterous Abundance, you didn't have a deadline. It wasn't a commission. It wasn't.
Right.
you weren't getting paid to do it. You didn't have a place to. You just had this little space, and you're like, I'll start doing it, and
Right.
it evolved for you, by you, and by itself. It was a dialogue between
Yes.
you and the wheelbarrow or
Right,
something.
right. Yeah.
And I think that's maybe a different way of working than you were working in the 70s or in the 80s, or when you were teaching at the community college and making furniture.
Yeah, I think that's true. The Preposterous Abundance is very improvisational. I did have some notions of where I wanted it to go, but I was really just fooling around and letting my intuition guide me about the different parts and pieces of it. A lot of found materials, some things constructed of found materials. And, it sounds very casual and off the cuff, but through all of that, there's still this formal sense of design that I can't help but bring to things. And,
course, yeah.
and there is that balance, that visual balance, and there are sometimes I would attach a pipe to lift a thing, and I would go back and say to myself, nope, got to be 4 foot higher, or got to be over a couple of inches to please me,
Right.
and my eye, and that was a really compelling experience to have done that for myself, and then have it, be welcomed by passersby and people. People like it a lot, and
A
that's
lot
been,
of people have seen
yeah,
it. And
yeah.
yeah. I think the ability to do that, to balance that improvisational work, but with the eye towards balance and structure and being a skilled maker, comes maybe with age too.
Yes.
After 40, 50, 60 years of doing this kind
Yes.
of thing,
Yes.
we can let go in a certain way and let stuff flow,
Yeah.
without the fear that it's gonna fall over or
Right.
whatever.
Right. There's more trust in oneself.
Yeah. And I think that's great. And I do think, some people have that young. I know people who do that young, but for me, it's something that comes more with age. And I think that's
Yeah. Agreed.
a good thing about age. Not everything about getting old is great.
Right.
That's a good one. You're back listening to Coffee and Culture. I'm Matthew Chase Daniel, talking with James Gould and his new just finished sculpture, SPRICKLE, will be in the Railyard Park as part of the Railyard Art Project, which is a project of the Railyard Park Conservancy. There's a group of people who are on a thing called the Railyard Art Committee who curate that space. I am one of them, happy to say. And we had a call for entries several months ago or a year ago or something, and James was one of the people who applied, and we adored his piece, and so it's going in. There's a second piece that we also chose that'll go in around Earth Day in April, and the piece by James, SPRICKLE, will be there. It's there now, and it will be up into June of this year, 2025, and we will be having an opening reception for James, with James, on Saturday, February 8th from 11:30 to 1 at the SPRICKLE Sculpture. We're going to have fresh coffee from Java Joe's and some breakfast snacks, probably muffins, bagels, and fruit. And we may have some music as well. We're still working that out, so please come by, meet James, check out the thing, ask him questions, and have some coffee and food, 11:30 to 1, Saturday, February 8th. That said, there's also, James is having an exhibition at the Center for Contemporary Arts, which I don't know a lot about. I don't know when it opens or what it is, but tell us a little bit about that.
Well, that's going to be in the cinema lobby in May, and I think it might run May, June, July. Exact dates to be determined.
Yeah, those are good time of year out there.
Exact content of exhibit to be determined. I'm keen to resume my long love affair with painting, and develop a new body of work for that exhibit. Might also have some pieces outside, that's kind of to be determined. And yeah, I mean, lately, big surprise seeing the work that I've done lately, that there is a kind of excessive, like lots of parts, lots of elements mashed together. And so when I think about an exhibit, I think, oh, I could have this, and I could have this, and I could have this little gang of things, and I'd need to, kind of play that out with some other parties to say, what do you think? Like, should I, have it just be lean, just a few pieces, or,
right,
include some small sculptures and found objects and photographs and paintings and drawings and
right.
pieces outside, or maybe just 5 pieces. I don't know. So
most of that gallery mostly shows works on the walls. Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. Hence the painting.
Yeah.
Aspect and the per our conversation with the notions of control and freedom and letting things go. The way that I love to paint is really very messy and pushing paint around. Is definitely abstract painting. Mm-hmm. I like to paint over a lot and improvise, and pretty much it's an approach to painting that is very much determining the thing and the end along the way. It's responding to what's there and improvising and
right. You don't have an idea in mind of what it's going to look like when you start.
No. And that's also, it's a difficult way to work because you can go on endlessly and
or you can have a hard time starting.
Or you can. I have no problem starting. It's really I get in there, and then I often stall for a variety of reasons. But it kind of goes back to what I was mentioning about the belief that and I've thought about you in this context too, Matthew, because you're a man who bursts out in song, and you, somewhere in your being, you seem to believe that I can just bust out singing,
even if it sounds horrible.
And I love that about you.
Yeah.
Myself, I am terrified of singing because God forbid I should be out of tune, and oh my God. So I don't believe that I can bust out in song. Therefore, I don't.
Right.
But
I understand that. This is when my friend Jerry and I started Axel Contemporary. For those who may not know, is an art gallery in an old bakery delivery truck. A bunch of stuff led up to us thinking of doing this, and none of those things was like a good business plan. And it was a stupid idea, I could dare say, and a weird idea, and yet by embracing the stupid, weird idea that doesn't really make a lot of sense, we hit upon something that there was a hunger for here in Santa Fe, and that was very successful in its strange way. And now we're in our 15th year or something. And that sometimes the things that you don't believe you can do or should do or are good ideas are the source of the best idea.
Yes.
And so I break out in song, and you should too.
Noted.
So the other day when I was working with James, I was getting ready for this interview. So James sent me some writings he had done, and one of the things was how he grew up in Lockport, New York. So I looked up Lockport on a map, and I saw that it was on the Erie Canal. And as a kid, I had learned this song maybe in 6th grade music class of the Erie Canal, which I will not sing here. Well,
but he does a very respectable version.
Yeah, I do better if I play guitar a little bit. Got me a mule, her name is Sal, 15 miles on the Erie Canal. So
yes, I was so impressed when Matthew busted out in singing just out of the blue on the job site.
Yeah.
Very appropriately.
And you didn't know that I knew you were from Lockport yet. You thought that was an odd coincidence.
Well, that's true. Yes, I was very impressed at the depth of your homework. So.
Anyway, Yeah, the Erie Canal is a fascinating thing. I was driving a few years ago, my wife Julie and I, from Western Mass back here, and we followed basically the Erie Canal up to Buffalo. And so I was listening to some podcast about a history of the Erie Canal, which I knew a little bit of, but it was just sort of an amazing time when Buffalo was like the gateway to the west of America for the settler colonials, as we now call them. And that it was the main thoroughfare for transporting lumber, coal, and hay, I believe, as the song says.
Well, and the other link to our conversation along the ideas of crazy ideas.
Yeah.
So there was Mr. Clinton, whose idea it was to do the canal. So like you and Axel contemporary, who says, hey, let's do this gallery in this old bakery van. How crazy is that? So here you have Mr. Clinton, probably in the 1800s somewhere. I should know that date, but I don't. But we'll just say 1800s. So he's like, hey, I want to build this canal, like from the Hudson River up to the Niagara River. And I'm sure he was met with like, that's a crazy idea, buddy.
Yeah.
So, but I'll tell you,
that was pre-railroad. So things moved by boat, and you could go from New York City up the Hudson on the Erie Canal to Lake Erie, right? And then you could go through the different lakes and like down the Mississippi. I mean, you can go far.
Sure. Well, my favorite thing about the Erie Canal, or one of, and I've got an old postcard that shows it, which if I had full access to my personal archive, I would slap it down on the table right now. But it's a lovely old postcard that shows the canal going over the Genesee River in an aqueduct. And I just think that's a crazy thing.
Because they couldn't intersect.
They do now. But back in the day,
it went over.
It went over the river. And
the barges would go up in.
Well, they just somehow the hydrology of it was sorted out. But,
that's fascinating. But we're out of time.
Okay.
Thank you, James, so much.
Thank you, Matthew.
Everyone, come to the Railyard on Saturday, February 8th, 11:30 to 1. Have some fresh coffee from Java Joe's, breakfast, snacks, and talk to James and see the SPRICKLE. Go in May to the CCA Cinema Lobby Gallery and see another show of James. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Matthew.